you just look at the past FIFA 2010 World Cup, our whole approach on the continent, the theme of what we were doing was all about Africa United. And I think that hopefully answers the first question. But before I sort of just go through the whole sort of our approach to branding and everything else, I think for me personally, a brand at any time is all about aspiration. It's not about where you are today. It's really about where you want to go in the future and where you want to end up. And the brand cannot stand in isolation to reality. So where the business is at, because marketers often say, you know, this is how my brand needs to be positioned, this is how we need to be, but the business lags that. So the business objectives and the brand objectives always need to be in tandem, but the brand needs to be up there from an aspiration point of view. So I just think if I just quickly take you through the FIFA journey of MTN, you know, it's like everybody thinks, well, I always say FIFA for sponsors, or, I mean, Ivan, of course, I probably spoke about it this morning, just saying 11 June to 11 July 2010, that's when everybody sort of got busy and excited about it. But our business made the decision to get involved in FIFA 2010 in 2006. And in 2006, we were only in 6 countries on the continent, and we only had, you know, about 20-odd million customers. And now we're talking about a global sponsorship. From a rights fee and everything else point of view, that's sort of very seriously putting your money where your mouth is. But I think prior to that, in 2005, as a business, we specifically said, we need to have a global vision. You know, most businesses, most textbooks, Marketing 101 will tell you that. So here's your vision. And our vision was very bold in its simplicity, basically just saying, as MTN, we want to be the leader in telecoms in emerging markets. Today, we are in 6 African markets, but our vision as a business, we want to be the leader in telecoms in emerging markets. So from that day, we said, as a brand, every single one of our 6 countries had, at the time, their own identity, whatever they were promising the market, doing their own little thing. There was no cohesive strategy. So then we said, okay, monolithic global brand strategy with a very clear, aspirational global brand vision, supporting what the business wants to do. And we basically said, okay, this is MTN with 5 core values, and the biggest value was can do. It's like when everybody else says why, we as a business say, why not? So the kind of people you employ, everything you do is about can do. And from that you flow with leadership, integrity, innovation, everything else. So we had 5 core values, but the biggest one was can do. And that's how the journey started. Then we said, okay, so 6 markets, the business is going in one direction, the brand complementing what the business is doing. And then it was, okay, so busy with our M&A strategy, organic growth in our existing markets, and really building, always building, and the whole can-do philosophy. So the next logical move was to say, title sponsorship of something like the African Cup of Nations for MTN. In 6 countries only, once again, but the African Cup of Nations, because emerging markets obviously also included the Middle East. And the first African Cup of Nations happened in Cairo, in Egypt, in 2006. And if you can recall, in 2006, MTN also did the Investcom deal, which added all the Middle Eastern countries to our portfolio, as well as quite a large number of countries on the continent. So all of a sudden now, our story was different. So you had AFCON, Egypt, we're talking the story on the continent. Whoever rules Egypt, or whoever conquers Egypt rules Africa. That's just a communication line. But from there you start building to say in 2008, MTN Africa Cup of Nations was in Ghana. So we started as little MTN, then it was Africa, so the logical next step was FIFA. To say FIFA, MTN was also born in 1994, and how we grew with the nation in a way, and then where else we went. And that's why we said, you know, it's like, I'll cut my story short because otherwise I can continue forever, but to say, it's about can-do, it's about aspiration, it's about a journey, it's about a brand complementing your business objectives. And, you know, it's like what we said in MTN when Monsieur Shabalala scored the first try in FIFA 2010 World Cup, we said Ayoma, you know, because we're talking South Africa. When Ghana got to the quarterfinals, we said Africa United, you know, we all won. And sort of, you know, when Sepp Blatter gave South Africa 9 out of 10 for hosting the World Cup and saying, you know, it's not sort of the fact that South Africa did it. What we said in our business, it was how we did it. And I think that, once again, was the can-do. Not the fact that we did it, it was how we did it. And then we said sort of, Ayoba, Africa United, everything else. So that is the journey. So it's never a, this is where I am today, doom and gloom, blah, blah, blah. It's, where do you want to end up? Here's my brand. Make sure your brand aspirations and your business aspirations are aligned. And that for me is the crucial thing.
I think that very, very, very helpfully picks up on exactly the dynamic that I think emerged in Dr. Moyo's discussion of where we are and where we might be with some simple fixes. Oliver Schmitz, perhaps you're a good person to turn to now, because in terms of the Brand Finance Global 500, the African brands that make it into that list are pretty few and far between. They make up a minute fragment of the actual market cap of that list. I think it's something like a 0.1%. But African brands have made it onto that list. I don't know if that's because they are able, as Santie suggests, to tell a powerfully aspirational story, to move beyond the existing conditions in reality, as well as telling a powerful story. But maybe you can speak to a little bit about what makes those brands stand out, and how are they able to free themselves from the other brand Africa.
As we've been introduced, I'm Oliver Schmitz from Brand Finance, and I'll be talking about the value of brands, of African brands, specifically in the Global 500. Just a small introduction, born and bred with the best of Benoni, and while Charlize went off to Hollywood to find fame, I went off to London for a little bit of travelling and for a little bit of work experience. It's in London that I met this good-looking gentleman. It's not Robert Redford, it's my CEO, David Haig. David founded Brand Finance 15 years ago. We're now in 20 different countries. Our core services focus around valuation, analytics, strategy and transactions for highly branded enterprises. So now I'm back in South Africa. I've got the vuvuzela, I've got the sunglasses, I've got the socks and jocks, and although that doesn't make me play at 23, it does make me proudly South African, and that gives me a little bit of credit to stand up here and really talk about our brand. So why are brands so important? And to illustrate, we're going to have a look at Coca-Cola as an example. So 40% of Coca-Cola's enterprise value is attributable to the Coca-Cola brand. Add into that other brands in the portfolio, Sprite and Fanta, they generate 15% of the total enterprise value, meaning the residual 45% can be allocated to recipe and tangible assets. There's another reason now, and there's another demonstration of just how important brands are by the new ISO standards that have come out. So we've got ISO standards for quality management systems, complaints, environmental management systems, and now we've got ISO 10668 for brand valuation, and that's actually been launched this month. How do we measure brand strength? So brand strength is one of the important parts of a brand valuation. We look at a number of different inputs, brand equity and output KPIs, which we put into an index. We use these because we can demonstrate that over time, as you invest in a brand, it builds on drivers of consumer brand equity, thereby increasing satisfaction or preference for your brand, and that shows an output and uplift on your output KPIs. That brand strength index, it also affects market share directly, and that has a direct impact on revenue. It helps us to determine the royalty rate in evaluation, and it also helps us to adjust brand-specific risk in the discount rate. So now that we've just considered the impact, let's just have a look at some of the results. So the 2010 Brand Finance Nation Brands League table is being launched this week. Initially, this started as a collaboration with Simon Anholt using the Anholt GfK NBI. This year we've used IMD, but we're hoping to update the valuation once the NBI is updated and we can get our hands on that. Going to the results, the top 10 countries. America has got a brand value of $10.6 trillion. We also see some of the other bigger players there. And just so this really just demonstrates the sheer dominance of these markets, supported by the size and the strength of the brands that are being born out of these markets. The question is, where's Africa in all of this? And out of all the African countries, the only country to make it was South Africa. We valued 57 countries in coming to this, in concluding this study, and the one problem was purely lack of transparency, lack of data for African countries. So they weren't included except for South Africa. So there's an invitation here for all the directors of nation brands. Help us get the data, help us get you into the league table, let's get Simon involved, and let's really build this and get all the individual nation brands on there. Coming back to South Africa now and South Africa's performance. South Africa was ranked 40 out of 57 countries in this year's league table, with a brand value of $135 billion US. It receives a rating of A. The rating is sort of like a credit rating. It's up 4 positions from last year. It's had a 36% increase in brand value, and it's moved up 4 points. So it's moved from the A- rating to the A rating. If we had to put it into perspective, if brand value was the size of the instrument, then South Africa's brand would be that beautiful red vuvuzela there. And America at 60, or the USA at 67 times bigger, would be the grand piano. But we know that size isn't everything. We also need to take into consideration brand strength here. And so if size is the size of the instrument, brand value the size of the instrument, and brand strength is the noise that it makes, then South Africa's there. And to be standing on Durban beachfront during the World Cup blowing my vuvuzela, on the blowing side of it, it made such a sweet and satisfying sound. And now it's really allowing all the other nations to understand that. And let's get all those other African countries there blowing the same thing. Blowing that sound and really just generating this brand value for African countries, this brand value for Africa. So just talking at a high level, the results for South Africa. The BSI for South Africa, the Brand Strength Index, it's rated 36th out of 57 countries, ahead of countries like Spain, Portugal, and Russia. It's closed the gap on the leader from 25 points to 19 points. If we consider brand equity just one of the components that go into the BSI, South Africa is ranked 31st, its highest ever ranking. It's been the score's been boosted by a 38% increase on customer satisfaction, 28% on national culture, and 25% on quality of life and image abroad. And now that's all just following the successful hosting of the World Cup. The question really is, how long can South Africa sustain these levels? How long can they support it? Considering global brands now, so the Brand Finance Global 500, here are our top 10 brands. Again, it's interesting to see that 7 out of the 10 brands are from the USA. And it just demonstrates again the sheer size and scale against which African brands are competing. Where are the African brands? Well, MTN, They were ranked 179th with a brand value of $4.7 billion. That's up 29 places from last year. The only other African brand to make that, the table, was Vodacom at 399 with half the brand value of MTN. There were some other brands that just fell out of the 500, and that's the reason why African brands only generate 0.1% of brand value in the global Brand Finance Global 500. There are only 2 brands in there. And so, just to finish off then, that this is probably perhaps an indication of the lack of awareness and the performance of African brands within the global economy. We can see now that the strength in some of these brands are here, but unfortunately the size isn't yet. Thank you very much.
I think this is maybe an apposite moment to ask Prof. Nkomo about another aspect of Africa's brand in the world, and that's really leadership, and African leadership in global organizations, and Africa's ability to produce that kind of leadership. We've heard a little bit from Dr. Moyo about how we oughtn't to look to government, and we ought to turn to the people and to doing things ourselves. Prof. Nkomo, what does your research tell you about Africa's capacity institutionally, socially, and otherwise to produce global business leadership, whether it's working here or working internationally in organizations like SAB Miller, BHP Billiton, which might have large portfolios of brands, even if they aren't listed as brands in their own right?
Thank you, Nick. I think that in terms of leadership, especially business leadership, which is what I mostly study, I will not comment on political leadership because I think enough has been said about that. But in terms of business leadership, I would say that, especially in terms of South Africa, we have a number of outstanding business leaders in this country who are leading successfully global companies. And in fact, it's quite ironic that some of the ideas that people here have around Ubuntu, collective leadership, is gaining interest in other countries of the world. So I would say in terms of that particular brand, that we do have a cadre of excellent business leaders, and we also are faring quite well in terms of the work that our business schools are doing in producing MBAs. We have 17 different business schools offering MBAs in South Africa in particular, and we are turning out young business leaders who can compete with the likes of Harvard, your legendary schools. So I think that that is one aspect that I would say is very positive. I was sitting here thinking that part of the challenge is for governments in Africa is to perhaps learn from some of the successes of business leadership. I don't think enough is done I think governments are suspicious of business leaders, maybe there are good reasons for that, but I think we need to do much more partnering between the capabilities of business leadership and political leadership. So yes, I think we're doing quite well in terms of that.
I guess the question then is how do we bridge the gap between those potentialities and those capacities that you identify and that I think we've heard about a bit in the other presentations, not just potentialities but also, if you like, growing clusters of entrepreneurial and business energy and the capacity really to take countries in the continent and the continent broadly onto a higher growth path. And I'd like to bring Lumkile Mondi in here, perhaps to give us a sense of how we understand, if you like, the contradiction between what we constantly hear about higher than average growth in Africa relative to the global environment, resource competition perhaps fueling that to a degree, perhaps some of those potentialities being unleashed, and yet at the same time the difficulty that we have in converting that into sustainable development and really an environment in which all of these capacities can be catalyzed.
Thank you very much. I think that is a touch on one of the issues. I think for us sitting down south, one of the interesting challenges that we faced is the dominance of China and India in the rest of the continent, particularly given our history and our capability South Africa in industrialization. As you know, we have a lot of cattle dealing in South Africa, in the sense that we have experiences of going down the value chain. That is all the way from taking out a primary product up to producing a product that is exportable, that meets global standards. And the challenge, I think, that South African businesses, outside services, I think on services, we've taken the mantle, we've moved to the continent. MTN is there, YT person is there, and many other services. But I think where it's been very, very difficult is in the real sector of the economy. As an example, what we've seen as the IBC is exactly being asked to take leadership in transferring our knowledge base of over 70 years industrial development to the rest of the continent. A story that for us was very attractive. In fact, it came at the back of the Solomon government, in the DRC, where there was some form of stability that was coming in the DRC. Parliament South Africa playing a peaceful role, trying to build new institutions of governance, making sure that the government of the DRC can have institutions to collect revenue, led by the National Treasury team to build that. And in the process, ourselves and some foreign companies, a company that some of you know very, very well, called Metrorex, through the investment that we injected, we started mining copper and beginning the early stage of beneficiation in the DRC. Unfortunately, 2 years ago, the government got greedy, as Dawes has been arguing about not believing politicians. They got greedy. They decided overnight that they suspend all mineral rights. So, fortunately, Metrorex still survives. It goes on. It's a very wonderful business. 2 of our businesses are all in the judicial courts. We're contesting, we're having a dogfight with the Kabila government. The first asset is Godwezi, tailings. The second one is something called Tentofungarumi. But these are just small challenges in a bigger continent. I think there is a huge potential for us, because what the Chinese have shown us in the recent past 5 years at the height of the plan is that their way of doing business is to take unbeneficiated raw primary products into a cargo line back to China. So there's no attempt really of trying to build sustainable industries, which could go in some way of trying to build an intra-African industry, which Dawes was talking about in terms of trade, that is only 2%, or only 2% of global trade. So we see quite a lot of potential in the medium term, particularly given the fact that the Chinese, although they put money, we don't think they're the game yet. So the challenge is among all of us Africans to how to change the game the way it's being played. So the real, our immediate challenge is how to work with the private sector, making sure that at the back of the private sector, we can take away the risk, because the IBC's role will not run businesses in the African continent. We want to, private sector, as partners, we get together, we take away all the risk, all the nonsense that we have to deal with our politicians, with the government, but at the same time, we put our money so that we have a joint and renewable business. So I think of pivotal importance is the continual reversal of the transparency gains that Dawes also talked to. That number of countries where 5 years ago we'd gone 10, 15-fold, we've gone backward. The regimes are closing back in. The regimes are becoming much more aggressive. And in the process, there's a lot of looting taking place, and that's leading to a lot of frustration around creating African capabilities in terms of industrializing Africa, making sure that Africa does have a vibrant manufacturing sector, because we know that if we have growing incomes, then it makes it easier for us to have goods that are produced in South Africa and Southern Africa and the rest of the continent being sold here, manufactured here, sold here, and upping skills that could increase wages and move a lot of our people above the $500 per annum that Dambisa was talking to. So we are ready as IBC to create a brand Africa, to be a partner of the private sector in making sure that as we blend and move our continent from a primary commodity producer into an industrial, world-class continent, competing with all the other continents, that IBC becomes relevant in that layer.
I think we hear something very important in the background of that, which is about what kind of capital we're able to attract into projects in Africa. Is it kind of cowboy capital that goes into super high-risk environments in expectation of a super high-risk return and gets out rapidly? Or is it patient, long-term capital that can go into well-governed markets and take long-term decisions? And I think that in the DRC example that you mentioned, we hear something about how patient capital, improvement in governance, can actually catalyze something quite special, but the obstacles around governance and the breakdown of that can quite quickly put it at risk. So I think that's a very salutary kind of point to refer to on this question of where we sit in the journey between brand, disease, famine and war, and brand potential. And I think this is a very good point to bring in Jay Naidoo, because really as chair of an organization that's about nutrition, clearly you can't catalyze people's potential if they're underfed. We know all the terrible consequences of that for people's intellectual development, their physical capacity, etc. But we've also heard about the risks for Africa of the Bono story and the Pity story, and the possibility that a certain amount of space in the economy and in the social structure gets filled up by certain sorts of NGOs. So maybe, Jay, if you could talk a little bit about how NGOs, governments, partnerships with the private sector can actually catalyze potential instead of stultifying and creating a culture of dependence.
Thanks, Nick. And I am sort of the only person in this panel, I suppose, in the room that's been part of government. Well, I could think I was part of Mandela's cabinet. But I also been part of the first general secretary of COSATU, so some of you might hold that against me. So, I think it's very important to understand what will make Africa a success. And the role of government cannot be marginalized. In reality, the South African budget is 800 billion rand. We spend 160 billion rand on education. Our outcomes in education are worse than that of Kenya. So we really have to ask the question, what do we expect of government? What does our constitution give us rights to? And how do we ensure accountability and performance of our governments to the things that we have elected them to do for us? And if I really look at the issue of the aid that comes to Africa, in 2008 they estimated at $22 billion. And our budget is $100 billion. So I sit on the Gates Foundation Advisory Panel on health, and their budget as one of the biggest foundations in the world is about $3 billion a year. So there's no way in which we can really reach scale if we don't get government to do what we elect them to do. And that's part of why we need people that are informed, people that are educated, people that are organized, who can demand their rights. And it's not rocket science. We defeated the most powerful government in Africa and brought them to a negotiating table where we have achieved democracy and the deracialization, at least of politics. We've got a long way to go before we can say we have social justice and economic justice, because 1 in 4 children in South Africa is malnourished, and that happens during the pregnancy of a mother and a child under 2. If you don't deal with nutrition in that critical period, you've missed the boat, even if you win the lotto. So 25% of our children in sub-Saharan Africa, we have disadvantaged their potential before they even have a chance. So we've got to get the issue of priorities. And what are our priorities? how do we get accountability and how do we put performance at the center of all our debates? Ultimately, it is the role of a partnership between public, private, and civil society. So, I was debating a day ago, and the remarkable thing about China, and there are lots of problems that they have there. They have huge problems of corruption, particularly at the local level. There are massive demonstrations in China. And yes, they sit with huge challenges of poverty. Like Lisa said, probably 500 million people are still in rural areas trapped in poverty, where there's land speculation and where people are being abused by the bureaucracy. But they've taken 500 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years. We've seen incomes grow. And we've seen China become the factory of the world. So while there is all the challenges we face in Africa, they've done something. And that goes back to the issue of leadership, values, and accountability. And we must be absolutely clear about Africa. We've gone through 2 decades of a boom in the commodities market. China has an agenda in Africa. It's the agenda of China. India has an agenda in Africa. It's the agenda of India. The US has an agenda in Africa. It's the US agenda. We are naive to think that the people that come into our continent, even the ones that are here to help us, that have no agendas. Everyone has an agenda. The critical question we should ask ourselves, what's the African agenda? And that's where we fail, because we leave it to someone else. So if one was to take the issue of, I chaired a sister organization to what the IDC is called, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, for 10 years. Let me give you an example of the type of project we do there, because it's a development finance organization. Because I agree with the concept that there's dead aid, but does all aid need to be dead? It's dead if the money goes to corrupt officials who put it in Swiss bank accounts. It's dead if it goes to consultants that come from the host country. It's not dead if we can get proper use of it. So one of our challenges is to create the notion of blended financial models. The role of development finance is patient capital. That means it's there for the long term, and we're interested in a development outcome as well as economic outcome. And so yes, one of the things we did, one of the projects was like the IDC, a third of our money, which is close to 3 billion rand a year, goes outside of South Africa. In Lesotho had a huge crisis of health delivery. They needed a hospital, because they were spending money because people come to hospitals in South Africa. The government puts out a proposal for a public-private partnership. It's run by one of the local companies here. But there are conditions. They have to link up to local groups there, which include professionals, and eventually you have a public-private partnership that's already starting its operations, where government saves money, where the development bank puts in something like 800 million rand as the mezzanine finance and debt. And the government puts in its equity contribution. There are tough conditions in terms of outcomes and the cost of those outcomes. And part of the responsibility of the consortium is to rebuild the healthcare system from primary to tertiary level. So you have a successful outcome. Everyone wins. That's not rocket science. At the end of the day, science does matter in more places than what we think. Because we want to be part of this thing called BRIC. Britain, Brazil, Russia, China, and India. These are the big league players who are the new powers of the 21st century. It's a reality. We'll be naive if we think that we can grow in isolation up there. But there the science matters. Because what are we as South Africa with 50 million people? We fit into 3 Chinese cities. So yes, we've got to build Africa. And we've got to get Africa's governance aligned with where we want to take the continent. If you look at the Mo Ibrahim Index, the bottom 10 countries in governance that we measured governance in Africa, are the same 10 countries where we have conflict, we have poverty, we have inequality, we have dysfunctional societies. So governance and the issue of growth and development is important. Last point I want to make is it's great to have businesses like the MTNs of this country. But the question I want to ask the CEO of Patumo, Clego, and yourself is what are you doing to go beyond the great profits that you are making and the great commitments to FIFA? Because I think FIFA was a mafia that made most money in the world. And that's the honest bloody truth. We build Rolls-Royce stadiums here when we can have Toyota Corollas to deliver an equivalently successful World Cup. Do we need stadiums which has jacuzzis in it? Do we need stadiums where one bar on the central stadium costs 400 million rand? It's nonsense. Because we allowed ourselves to be bullied by FIFA. Because we don't have the courage to stand up and say, listen, this is where it stops. Don't come and take over our country. So the question we have to ask countries like the MTS, what are you doing beyond the gender that Mondi talked, to build capacity, to build real enterprises, because no company in the world can succeed and be part of the brand in Africa if you don't deal with poverty, inequality, and malnutrition, and the challenges that face women in this country. So let's not have an issue about branding. What matters about your brand is how successful you are as a society, and a company can only be successful if the society is successful. Thank you.
All right, well, you've been put on the spot, Santie. I think I should give you a right to reply, because we believe in that in my profession. And then I'm going to ask Visa to do a brief wrap-up before opening it to the floor.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our business, now I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not on behalf of Tuma, is, as MTN, our philosophy in every single market where we operate, over and above building the economy of the country, we employ local people. So it's not a question that you export expats. It's very much a question of local people with the right skills, and as the business grows, the expertise in the market also grows. And what we find very often as MTN is the skills that we develop gets poached, obviously by new competitors and stuff like that, and you build more. You know, so really, if you talk capital, human capital, there's a massive investment going in on that. Then if you say, you know, CSR or CSI, I mean, it's such an overused term, but the work that MTN is doing in our MTN foundations across every single one of our markets, when it comes to teacher education and stuff like that, is huge. And also our shareholders in each of our markets are local people, and the relationship with governments is absolutely crucial for MTN. You know, so that's just in a nutshell. I'm not a politician, so you know, I'm not going to get so for me, where I'm sitting is really saying in Africa, and I hear the whole debate about brand Africa, but for me, what's important, we need to look at the success stories in Africa, because the whole story about BRIC as well. China is one country, India is one country, Russia is one country, you know, Brazil is one country, Africa, you know, there's more than 50 countries with cultures. And then if you talk, people often talk about the West and the East and the South. Yes, there's the West, but every single country is vastly different, with vastly different cultural nuances. So my view always is focus on the success stories, and rather build and learn from the success stories on the continent. And so how do you make sure, you know, as there's the good old saying, when your house is a mess, you don't invite guests. Or you invite, when you're building, you invite your architects or people that's going to assist you. So for me is, what do we want to achieve as a continent? What do we want to showcase to the world? And do it cohesively, instead of talking these big, you know, it's like a brand Africa. What does it mean? You know, and rather say, where's the success stories of Africa, and make sure that we showcase that to the world. And it's all about attitude when you go out there as well. So it's the whole can-do scenario, which I think is what every African should adopt.
Now, I would have thought the short answer to Joe's question was that the economic enablement performed by mobile telephony in Africa is an extraordinary social contribution.
Exactly.
People can check prices at markets. People can communicate between cities. But anyway, I'm not here to advocate for you. So at this point, I want to give Dambisa the last word, and maybe if I could ask you to respond a little bit to this, and I think it's a theme that's been sitting underneath some of the conversation, and it's a question about closedness and openness in African markets. Santie said you don't invite guests in when your house is a mess. I hear that from a marketing point of view. Maybe from a governance and development point of view, exactly the opposite is true. Even in South Africa right now, we hear increasing pressure, including from within government, for a more closed economy, more trade barriers, more statism, etc. And Lumkile mentioned how across the continent, when they're looking at investments, they increasingly see governments, unlike Rwanda's perhaps, wanting to close down a bit more. So I don't know if you want to respond to that, maybe in picking up some of the threads for a few minutes of the conversation, and then I'll open up to the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. All very interesting indeed. First of all, I just want to comment on something that General McChrystal, who actually has been fired, but I think he also had something brilliant to say. So this was the general who was U.S. general who was in charge of Afghanistan and Pakistan. He said, we all need to address issues from where we are, not where we want to be. And I think that's really important, particularly in the African context, because like it or not, we've invited people onto this continent, even though the house is completely in disarray. I want to start by also saying that I think there are fundamentally three things that we all agree on, probably on this panel, and I think internationally, as a global community, we all agree on. First of all, point one, Africa cannot be on aid forever. We don't want it to be on aid. In terms of our branding, we do not want this continent to continue to be an impoverished place where all people think about are the four things that I said earlier. The second thing, to pick up on Jay Naidoo's point, we absolutely need African governments on board. But not just any old ramshackle governments. We need serious governments who are actually committed and determined to solve the problems of this continent. And the fact of the matter is, across this continent, we just don't have that, and we have to face it. I mean, whether we like it or not. The third point is actually a point that I stole off of the Minister of International Development from Norway. And people in here might know that Norway gives 1% of its income to aid. And I don't know why they invited me, but they did, to Oslo, and I went. I'd never been. And the Minister of International Development said in a public forum that we have to accept, whether we like it or not, that aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of African governments. And this is critical because it's not just that African governments steal the money. Oh yeah, that's all obvious. But it's created a dysfunctionality in that African governments, who are charged with the responsibility of not only providing education and healthcare, infrastructure, and national security, but also creating an environment where we can create jobs and build companies. They've not done their job. Simply put, they have not done their job, like it or not. I also want to bring up a point here. I was invited to the IMF, and if I look back on the past 18 months that I've been going around the world and marketing my book, the one thing where I really was heartbroken was a comment that I heard from a very senior official at the IMF, which was that, and by the way, many of you will know, we're celebrating 50 years this year of many African countries being independent, some of them even more than 50 years. A comment from a senior official at the IMF was the following. Out of 50-odd countries, 53 countries, there are only 2 countries in sub-Saharan Africa where the international community feels comfortable and confident that the government can even write a basic report on the key sectors of an economy. 2 out of 50, and my guess is South Africa and Botswana. But the whole rest of this continent is relying on the international community to write a paper on healthcare, on education. This is ridiculous. 50 years after independence. Patients' capital, we're all for it. We get it. We're in a situation, things have been going so bad that we've been going in the wrong direction. We need patient capital for sure. But we also need to understand that the times and the programs where aid has been successful, the Marshall Plan, for example, those programs were short, sharp, and finite. They were not open-ended commitments where there's no pressure for delivery of results. What kind of system system, economic, business, or political system, is allowed to perpetuate itself over decades, year in and year out, where the results are not showing. And this is really important because we can sit here and clap and cheer when we say, oh yeah, we need more aid for healthcare, or we need more help for education. That was not the original design for aid. Aid, the original goal was to provide support, to create investment, to create growth, and to reduce poverty. And governments, if they were serious and sensible, would use that additional generated capital through taxation to fund public goods, education, healthcare, and infrastructure, and national security. Instead, people don't talk about that anymore. People don't talk about the need for investment capital or aid monies to fuel economic growth through investment. All we hear about is how aid is now being used to do what I would consider things that government is supposed to be doing. Yes, let's all cheer that the Gates Foundation or USAID or DFID are providing money for HIV vaccines in Zambia. But that is not what it was designed to do. And the reason why it's important to understand that this is an issue is because over the long term it is unsustainable. The United States has almost 20% unemployment plus underemployment. 20%. I was there last week in the United States. There are people lying, you cannot believe it, that this is America. People lying in the train stations, no jobs. 1 in 10 Americans is out of work. In Britain, in October 20th, watch the headlines, there are going to be about 1 million people out of work in that country. Are these the countries that we're expected to sit back and wait for handouts to fund our health programs? Are these the countries that themselves are borrowing money from China? Are these the countries we're supposed to be sitting back and saying they're the ones who are going to fund our education? We don't have a strategy. That is the fundamental problem. These African governments are not saying, here's our plan, here's our strategy. They sit back and allow other people to do it. So I would say we all agree on what the issues are. But execution and a can-do attitude is important. I often wonder, what do African leaders think? You know, I know President Zuma was just in China, but many other African countries, 2006, they had that big fanfare in China. When they go to China and they see a country which in 30 years, just in our lifetimes, has gone from a per capita income less than Malawi to now lending to the United States and moving, as you say, 500 million people out of poverty. Do our leaders learn anything? Or do they just go there for, to buy new clothes? These are the issues. I'm not leave it there, but the fact of the matter is, governments have to do the right thing. They're not doing the right thing, and the reason why I'm a proponent of aggressively coming up with transparent goals to say we're going to cut back on aid over time. And I'm not an idiot, by the way. I mean, people say, oh no, then someone wants to kill African babies by turning off aid. Obviously, countries are different levels of education, of economic development. Zambia is completely different from Ghana. To have a blanket policy to say everybody gets 5 years is obviously ridiculous. But at the same time, to have open-ended commitments with no discussion about how Africa and Africans can stand on their own 2 feet and become equal participants of the global stage says to me that George Bush is right, that we're suffering from the soft bigotry of low expectations.
And perhaps what emerges from this discussion is a different idea about branding and a different idea about Afro-optimism versus Afro-pessimism, which is about a kind of realism that has to underpin sustainable rebrandings. I don't know, but let's open it up to the audience if there are lots of questions. I see one over there. There must be a roving mic in the blue shirt about halfway along.
If you were looking at the branding of Brand Africa, we have to accept that Brand Africa is the where we want it to be. It's really the starting point to say that it's not where we want it to be. To have a discussion like you just had now, that we live on CNBC and with broadcast around the world, to broadcast us once a week to show that we care and we can do stuff. That's the start of saying we're not where we want to be. To be an alcoholic and to cure yourself, you have to admit you're an alcoholic. This discussion I haven't heard very much before. But if we're going to go for the sub-brand of success, maybe we stop talking Brand Africa and we talk about upcoming Africa. Set some criteria, like we have the air access debate, countries ready and willing, crew. Why don't we talk sub-brands of countries that are ready? Why don't we form forums of countries that are ready? Those who want to work will talk to the world. Sub-brand Africa, as in, is that possible to have sub-brands that work? using the bad name Africa, because that's we can't go away from. How do we work with sub-brands? How do we control them? And how do we effectively take them out of the control of the government? Do we do the 3 guarantee never to break our internet link so we can publish to the rest of the world even if there is a need for it? We've got to think strategically around what governments can do towards our power.
We can't do the job, get out of the way. I mean, I was the first General Secretary of COSATU, when it was a dangerous period to be political and to organize people, and we started off in the hostels where people lived in the most terrible conditions, almost like concentration camps in those days. But we built a movement that really was the cornerstone of us winning the freedom that we had in this country. And that was about empowering people, about mobilizing people, about giving people the power in their own hands, that they control their destiny. And I think today we've given up power. You know, we have people in South Africa today who complain that we feel powerless. And I say, my God, you know, here you've got a constitution, you've got institutions, you've got democracy that works, and you feel powerless. You have a free media, and you feel powerless. You know, if we felt like we in the 70s, we wouldn't be here today. So it's a can-do attitude. We know what our rights are. We know the things that are going wrong. What can we do about it? Do it. If you're a parent and your child is in the school and the teacher is not teaching, why do we tolerate mediocrity? So I think the issue really has to be about putting performance and accountability at the center of our democracy. And whether that's in the public sector or in the private sector, we have private sector companies here that colluded on price fixing, on the most basic and fundamental staple foods, that contributed to the increasing malnutrition in this country. Bread. They colluded to raise prices of bread. That's corruption. So when we talk about the role of a predatory elite, don't just look at government. Look at the private sector. At the end of the day, I'm saying it is about values. Yes, we can create success stories. MTN is a success story. A number of companies, institutions like the IDC or the DBSA in government that are success stories. The Treasury is a success story in this country. Not everything is bad. But I think the question is about making our voices heard. And, you know, we are so secure sitting in Santie, you know, the centerpiece of Africa, this great African city. 10 kilometers from here, you'll see real poverty. But we're blind, all of us, we're blind. We embrace all the foreigners that came here for our World Cup, but we're scared to embrace the poor who live in our midst. So what does that do? It unleashes xenophobia, it unleashes the type of conflict, it unleashes brutal crime. Because young people in this continent feel there's no one who cares for them, no one who listens to them. And if we don't deal with the issue of what I talked about in terms of a youth bounce, the population of Africa is young. They feel they're not part of the system. We can talk till we're blue in the face, well, I'm black in the face, so, about brand. And there will be individual brands that are recognized, and we sort of scrape into the top 500 companies, but not the continent, until we take power back to the people and demand what is our rights. We can take a lot of action to solve Zimbabwe's problems, but Zimbabweans have to stand up and fight for their rights. You know, and I think this is the message. It's about democracy. There's an integral link between democracy and the type of building the brand that everyone feels they're included in. You know?
I was going to ask you, about dealing with an awkward brand as well, because he asked about sub-brands. One of your competitors has employed a comedian to talk about its failings very publicly. I sense you don't think that was such a good idea. How do you deal with awkward brands and develop a portfolio that...
Yeah, for me, you know, and I'll caveat it again, I'm not a politician. Just listening to this conversation, I actually feel, wow, you need to get enough out and start slicing your wrist. So as the eternal optimist, just to answer your question, for me, I think what is crucial is that we have to look at success stories of countries. You know, so when you talk sub-brands, maybe pick 5 or 6 fantastic success stories, be it, and it doesn't have to be a brand as a corporate, but really a country that's made it. We've just had the World Cup in South Africa. And yes, I hear what you say, Jay, but I mean, the comments that come back, wherever you travel in the world, about South Africa, and how it was staged, and the expectations initially, and what transpired. The question then is, how do you build on that? Because that's a success story. To say 2010 is nearly over. Then you're in 2011, and people start talking about Brazil. So it's now when you say SA Tourism, the Minister of Tourism, or whoever else from a portfolio point of view that's responsible for this, for the country brand, is what are you doing to make sure that the positive stories of South Africa is getting out to the world? You've had 28 billion people cumulatively that watched just South Africa during that month. And that for me is the stuff to say, pick a few and build on it. Instead of, it's like, goodness gracious. And it also is a question of saying, okay, when we talk public-private partnerships, let's say, okay, which ones, and let's do it. So, because otherwise it's so broad, it's like, pick a number. But to say, here's 1 or 2 or 3, get serious business leaders and government leaders together in a room and say, here's our priorities, accountability, as you quite rightly say, Jay, and then with clear deadlines, and you run it as a business. So anyway.
Very good. All right, more questions. Over there in the red tie.
Thank you very much for a good discussion. My name is Hastings Chikoko. I'm from Malawi, but I work for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. I would like to just react to the Isamoy's thesis on African presidents and governments, and I would like also to ask Jenny to react to it. You have said that we shouldn't rely on these presidents because they are perpetuating this wrong brand of Africa through begging, and we should just forget about it. But I'd just like to say, don't you think that maybe Africa, as a continent, needs to revisit the criteria for electing these people into positions of power? And really, as we elect our leaders, we borrow from America and Britain, where the person's capability to position the American agenda on the international platform forms part of the criteria for electing that person into office. I think in Africa, this is my view, we focus more on the domestic issues. But that's fine. But we need to move further and also assess on the person's capability and performance on positioning the African agenda on the international market and influencing it. If the person is not doing it, if the person is portraying Africa as a begging continent, let's borrow all the principles of economics from Dambisa Moyo and be very economic with our votes and put them out. Thank you.
Okay, Dambisa, can Africans be less parochial in their leadership choices?
Well,
does
on
it
that
matter?
basis, I think we probably fire almost all presidents on this continent. Because the reality is, I'm struggling to think of any one of them that really stands up in a very positive light and says, you know what, I come from a fantastic continent. It's got, most until the arable land left on earth, young population. We've got minerals. We've got 500 stocks trading on 15 stocks. I've never heard an African president go out and talk about these things in the international space. What I would say is, it's unsurprising, I'm an economist, I'm not a political scientist. So my obsession is more about creating growth and reducing poverty rather than the relevance of political structures. I only object to political structures in as much as they are hurdles or they limit the ability to achieve long-term economic growth and reduce poverty. So what do I mean by that? For those who've read my book, you'll know that I think that the obsession with democracy per se is a misplaced one. Of course, I'm all for free representation. I mean, for God's sake, I'm a black woman from Africa. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say democracy is a bad thing. However, I do think that we've spent an inordinate amount of time focusing on democracy as a prerequisite for economic growth And rather than really thinking about ensuring that we get a critical mass of people who are who are in the middle class, who can then hold the governments accountable. Aside from the numerous countries that have achieved significant economic growth and reduced poverty in a meaningful way that are not democratic, whether it's in Chile or Singapore or Taiwan, the reality is that today, the second largest country on earth by GDP measure is China. And that country has achieved that by state-led economic development. So it is a value point, which I think Jay's point about accountability and values is critical. Because clearly, in these countries, whether it's Singapore, Chile, or China, the governments actually care about their people, and they have focused on delivering poverty reduction and economic growth. On this continent, save a handful of governments, the reality is it doesn't matter that there's democracy or not democracy. The reality is that the public policy and public politicians are simply not cared enough to do what they're supposed to be doing. They're much more obsessed about being in office, and they have been buttressed and allowed to stay in office, I believe, supported by the international community, even though they've not delivered on their promises.
All right, I'm going to fight the intense temptation to argue with Ambisa and bring the mic over here, please. Second row from the front, the lady in the red top. Actually, over here, sorry. And after this, I'm going to take one more, so we're going to have a violent competition of hands. All right, I'm back there.
My name is Kate Babela from the African Public Relations Association. I'm listening to the panel, and a part of me, I think, is breaking more than anything. Because I think one of the, I don't know what to call it, a crisis. I'm trying to look for a decent word. You know, every time, I remember my first trip or journey to Nigeria was in 2004. I remember when I said to my colleagues, I'm traveling, they said, I'm out of your mind. This is I'm a black African woman. I was speaking to Africans that I'm traveling to Nigeria. And someone says to me, are you out of your mind? And then you talk to the same person who says, I'm traveling to London. Where in London? What are you going to buy? And I'm sitting in this unbelievable audience, and I'm asking myself, what on earth am I talking about? Because until such time that there's a deliberate strategy for all Africans to comfortably travel to Nigeria, comfortably travel to Ghana, comfortably travel to Uganda. I've been to Uganda, and the high just after when the bombing took place, offense just after the World Cup, in the eve of the World Cup final. And I'm saying to myself, you can say all sorts of things and come up with all whatever programs. I'm saying, until such time that as Africans, we can comfortably go in and about in our continent, there's no way on earth that we can even think of billions that we are, of trillions of monies that we can make from each other. There's no way. So I'm saying to the panel, at which point do we begin serious regional economic integration, serious looking at ourselves and say, we are a market. We are going to consume our own goods. We are going to consume our own services. You find a consultant in London winning a tender in Tanzania, can't even find Tanzanians to even procure those goods for them. So I'm saying, at which point do we seriously, honestly, as a continent, begin to do business? Because we are sitting, we will not be there.
I think that's a question for Lumkile, really. I mean, and you can speak to what the IDC is actually doing in that regard a little bit, and perhaps some of the debates that are going on around regional integration right now, SACU, SADC, COMESA, etc.
I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks, and talk about something about first, the stumbling block is political leadership. The political leadership is failing in terms of a long-term agenda, as we've been discussing today. I'll mention one example. One of the strengths of South Africa particularly is to try and link the Southern African part to 2016. There's a project that's been going for the past 18 months called Trans-Kalahari Railway Line. It starts in Mafeking and it ends in Walvis Bay. So what I'm trying to do is to be able to move people from South Africa into, and goods of course, because boats, the watershed area and the Botswana, all the way, there's a lot of commodities, bulk commodities that you want to exploit there. And we're doing partnership with Emlo, BHP Britain, Exalo, because they quite dominant there. And that project has been a political hot potato, because South Africa, at some level, at the South African Customs Union, is refusing to make some concession on the transfers. Therefore, the national government says, no, we're not going to talk to you guys. This project can wait until your government start moving. Go to Namibia, see the response. So the point is that in as much as there's readiness, even on private capital, to move, to integrate, to make that dream of regional integration real, the enablers, unfortunately, particularly on infrastructure government, because you need servitudes. You need government to say, this land can be used for that. So if governments are squabbling over minute things, when in fact, particularly South Africa, we want people in South Africa, Botswanas, for the Libyans here. So we find that they're stumbling over small things that frustrating that. But I think, as we've seen with the MTNs, the YT persons, that's a move deal. We need to try and push that government. Unfortunately, on infrastructure, which is a main enabler, be present by government, until these governments are pushed, as other governments are pushed to make concessions in some of these things, it becomes a project that sits and gathers dust and then the